Hey everybody, it's Charmaine coming back at you from Charlotte, North Carolina Communications. I wanted to talk to you about the digital presentation that I'm going through on The Color Purple as an equipment for living. The Color Purple is a movie that you guys are probably familiar with. It's set in the early 1900s during a time when black women were treated as property instead of people, based on the book written by Alice Walker. But I wanted to tell you how this relates to an equipment for living based on my observation of this movie. First of all, communication is a very major part of this movie and how communication happened. With the main character, our protagonist, Celie, her communication was based on letters that she wrote in her mind and in her heart to God. It was based on her spirituality and how she needed to talk to people, and God was the only person that would hear her voice. So throughout this movie, you will constantly hear her communicating, but her communication is based on her spirituality. And as most of us believe, spirituality comes from either some type of higher being, whether it's God or whomever, but spirituality and communication is a major part of this movie and something that I really paid attention to while I was looking at it, because as an equipment for living, communication is one of the main things that we need. We don't do anything if we're not communicating. In this movie, you saw a lot of different things that were surrounded around race, black on black, male against female, white against black. Everything came back to a race type issue. And again, as I mentioned earlier in this film, it was how black women were treated as property, not as anything that was significant. And that it continues when you see it through the race, because black men felt they were inferior to white men. Black men felt like it was a race dominating thing to dominate black women. We cognitively choose whom we will trust. In the movie The Color Purple, Celie spent most of her life trusting one person, and that was her sister Nettie. When Nettie was taken away from her, it took her years to form a bond of trust, and she finally was able to make that connection when she began to trust Suge, and Suge began to trust her. That was a very important and motivating part of this movie, something that you can't live without in our society. You have to trust somebody. Throughout this movie, you saw different types of learning, how people learn, when they learn, and what they do to learn. Celie couldn't go to school, but her sister could, and their learning took place in the form of one teaching the other. So what Celie's sister learned in books, she shared with her, and what Celie learned in life, she shared with her sister. So most of us don't think about how much learning Celie gave to her sister in letting her know how to survive, because Celie has said, that's the only thing I know how to do is survive. Everybody else had formal education. Celie had life education. Throughout this movie, you saw a series of violent events. The first took place when Celie was separated from her sister by her husband, Mr., a man whose name she didn't know. He was just Mr. Throughout that, she saw how violent her husband was to her sister after he had been so kind before. Later, we saw Sophia badly beaten by who we can only assume were people in the jail, because she dared to stand up and say to a white woman that she was unwilling to become her maid. Violence was something that black women were familiar with, and unfortunately they accepted as a way of life. It's hard to say why black men agreed to be subservient to other people. This picture shows a grown man pointing a stick at another grown man, chastising him, and he's holding his hat almost in fear of what his father is saying. It's not out of respect, it's out of fear. At the end of years of abuse, torture, and not having anybody to love her, Celie finally got to a place where she was at peace, where she was now loved and able to love. The movie The Color Purple provides equipment for living based on how we as people need to accept others through communication, trust, learning, patience, and understanding.